Hello, this is Blase Bonpane with World Focus, coming to you from KPFK Los Angeles. We are podcast and available 24/7 on kpfk.org, where we're heard internationally. I'm privileged today to have Noam Chomsky as a guest. For the past 50 years, Noam Chomsky's writings on politics and language have established him as a preeminent public intellectual and one of the most original and wide-ranging political and social critics of our time. And now, just this month, we're going to have a new book, The Essential of Chomsky, which is now off the press and is a core work of his most important writings over the past several decades. It's an unprecedented, comprehensive overview of Noam Chomsky's thought. Welcome, Noam. Thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be with you again.
Well, Noam, I have a letter of resignation in front of me. It's not from Musharraf, it's from Fidel. Should they both be resigning? I mean, Musharraf doesn't intend to leave. Is that what's happening?
Well, Musharraf was roundly defeated in the election yesterday, which, as the press correctly reported, is a very serious blow to U.S. policy.
Yes.
The dictator had been strongly supported by the United States, is overwhelmingly opposed in the country. The combination of his rule and U.S. policies has made the United States extremely unpopular in Pakistan. It's way down at the, probably single figures in the polls. And there's very strong opposition to the U.S. intervening in any fashion in anything going on there.
The position of the U.S. is that having Musharraf in charge means that there'll be less fanaticism in Pakistan. Is that the line that they're giving?
He was just a loyal dictator.
Yes.
It's a very familiar story.
Oh, yeah, we've seen many loyal dictators over the years. And
in fact, he wasn't the worst figure in Pakistani history. I mean, the worst one was Zia-ul-Haq, Reagan's favorite. He's the one who, first of all, carried out the first nuclear test. The Reagan administration had to pretend they didn't know about it so that they could keep getting Congress to fund in violation of the law. But the main effect he had on Pakistan was to Islamicize it. I mean, it's the al-Haq dictatorship that introduced the ultra-fundamentalist Saudi-backed madrasas, which have changed the country enormously. I mean, it's just turned it into large parts of it into a kind of a medieval society. I have a good friend who's one of the leading nuclear scientists there and a leading opposition figure who says that they can't even get students into the universities now who have a basic science background. They study the Quran. It's contributed enormously to the rise of extremist fundamentalist views in the country and changed the character of it. That's Reagan's doing.
It sounds like Blaise Pascal, who said that evil is never done more thoroughly than it's done in the name of religion. And it's really a tragic thing. Speaking of religion, do you have any comments on Fidel's resignation?
Yeah. I mean, it was certainly coming, and it's time. What happened next ought to be for the Cubans to decide. I'm personally more interested in U.S. policy, something we can do. And it's very striking to watch and listen to the commentary. I haven't had time to read all of it yet, but the tenor is very striking. I listened to NPR I was stuck in a traffic jam yesterday, so I listened to NPR for a while.
Yes.
The commentary ranged from some ultra-right fanatic who was even condemning Castro for bringing killers and torturers to southern Africa, namely like Nelson Mandela, who praised Cuba for its astonishing and selfless record in liberating Africa, one of the reasons it's so hated in the United States. It's quite a story, and there's very good scholarship on it by now, so it's not seriously in doubt.
Well, Namibia and Angola were so striking, the presence of Fidel in both places.
In Angola, the Cubans entered. Piero Iglesias has done the main scholarly work on this, and it's unchallenged. He's from Johns Hopkins. in Angola, the South Africans invaded with U.S. support, and they would probably have established the Savimbi government or something like that, one of the U.S. favored terrorists, and a white racist regime. But the Cubans entered on their own. They didn't even inform the Russians. And they defeated South African mercenaries, which had a double effect in Africa. For one thing, these were black soldiers defeating white mercenaries. That just had never happened, so it had a kind of a shockwave over the continent, both in the black and the white community. And they also drove them out of Angola. And then they did the same in other countries in southern Africa. In fact, the liberation of southern Africa and the defeat of the apartheid regime ultimately was largely due to Cuban intervention.
Nelson Mandela certainly appreciated that.
Oh, yeah.
My God.
He recently made a strong statement expressing their appreciation for Cuba's intervention, which was completely selfless. They paid for it. They didn't even take credit for it.
That's right.
In fact, the information wasn't even known until Cageses dug it out of the archives.
It really is awesome. Some of the comments I have heard about hoping for a return of human rights in Cuba said by our own people as we occupy Guantanamo, that horrid center of torture.
The worst human rights violations in Cuba take place in Guantanamo.
It's really utterly
which is
amazing.
Furthermore, illegally held.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to wait for the investigations of Guantanamo to know that it's a torture chamber. I mean, if they weren't going to torture people, they'd have the prison in New York.
Exactly.
Just as high security as you like. But the idea is here to get them technically out of the reach of the jurisdiction of U.S. courts. It's all going through the Supreme Court now, but that's the only purpose of Guantanamo. And it's also illegal. I mean, the whole U.S. occupation of Guantanamo is kind of a bad joke. It's by a treaty that was signed with a gun to their heads back in 1902, and the treaty was for a naval station.
Well, in 1902, General Leonard Wood was the head of state. He was the first president after the liberation of Cuba.
And they sort of had a treaty like a Nazi treaty with Vichy France or something like that.
Well, it was the Platt Amendment went into the Cuban Constitution, which gave us the right to intervene for any reason. And of course, that stayed in until the Roosevelt administration.
But then the Guantanamo one stayed even post-Roosevelt, and of course Roosevelt himself violated that condition anyhow. So going back to NPR, the coverage that I heard over about half an hour was from this ultra-right fanatic, ranging over to the sort of liberal side, in which they quoted people who said that the embargo was failed, it wasn't useful, not that it was wrong. And I didn't hear one word about the U.S. terror operations in Cuba, which were extensive. They did interview some Cubans, even some Cubans in Havana, but only dissidents.
It's really amazing. I mean, there are 300 recorded attempts to assassinate Fidel.
Yeah, and that's the least of it. I mean, under Kennedy particularly, John F. Kennedy assigned Robert Kennedy, his brother, the task of supervising terrorist operations in Cuba as his highest priority. Arthur Schlesinger, in his sort of official biography of Robert Kennedy, says that his commitment was to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba, not just trying to kill Castro, which went on till practically the day of Kennedy's assassination, but also sinking fishing ships, attacking hotels, destroying major industrial and agricultural complexes. It was a serious terrorist operation. In fact, it still goes on. Miami is one of the terrorist centers of the world. There was, in fact, the NPR again. One of their guests, was a Representative Canf, which is a terrorist support operation.
Well, those have been operating with impunity. Alpha 66, Omega 7. Some actually operated in Los Angeles. About 30 years ago or more, the Haymarket Center here in L.A., a meeting center, was burned to the ground by Alpha 66, and it was kind of a ho-hum thing after it happened. Everybody said... It still
is a ho-hum.
Yeah.
There's something called the Bush Doctrine, which states that countries that harbor terrorists are as guilty as the terrorists themselves,
yes,
and have to be treated accordingly by bombing, invasion, and so on. Well, two of the leading international terrorists are happily living in Miami.
very definitely.
Orlando Bosch,
Yes,
who the FBI and the Department of Justice wanted to expel because he was a threat to U.S. national security. They accused him of about 30 terrorist acts. The Bush administration, this is Bush 1, kept him there. And now Luis Posada is there.
well, we had goodwill people, 5 people come from Cuba to try to identify the terrorism that was emanating from Miami, and of course they wound up with life sentences.
Right.
The Cuban 5 is an incredible case.
Yeah, they infiltrated the Cuban terror centers in Miami, and they got a lot of information. They invited the FBI to Havana,
yes,
to present the information to them.
exactly.
They presented the information, and the FBI acted, namely it arrested them.
Yeah, it is really such a cynical act. We have a huge billboard now at Hollywood and Bronson, says "Free the Cuban 5, unjustly held in U.S. prisons," and the case is very important.
Just to get back to the commentary to wind up, that's the range that I heard.
Yes,
From Cuban dissidents and people who say the embargo is a failure, to a crazed right-wing maniac who's accusing them of bringing killers and torturers like Mandela to Africa. Take a look at the Boston Globe this morning,
yes,
maybe the most liberal paper in the country. There's an editorial that says it does mention the embargo. It says it failed, and therefore was wrong. If it succeeded, it would be fine. And it said it gave Castro an opportunity to blame his failures on the United States, and he deftly provoked the United States. That's the only thing that happened in Cuban-American relations. And that's at the liberal side. Take a look at the candidates. Barack Obama, for example, said that if Cuba moves in the direction we prefer, then we should consider easing the embargo. I have yet to hear anybody say what the embargo is for.
it's an act of war.
Look, we know. I mean, the internal documents were released a long time ago. It started with Eisenhower, got much worse under Kennedy, got still worse under Clinton, and the goal was quite explicit: to make the Cuban people suffer so that they will then overthrow Castro. The embargo itself is international terrorism.
It is, and this is a time of a great deal of focus on immigration, and if people would study the Cuban Adjustment Act and the immigration, the selective immigration policies, people coming in from Cuba and being given a resident visa within the same day, another group coming in from Haiti and winding up in a federal prison or back in Haiti in a very short time. There's so much selectivity there.
And it's quite striking because Haiti, which is the leading target of U.S. intervention in the 20th century, is also far and away the poorest country in the hemisphere. That's a correlation, incidentally, which extends further. But yes, all Cubans are automatically accepted. Haiti has been, since Carter, worse under Reagan, under an illegal blockade.
Yes.
The Coast Guard blockades it to keep people from escaping from the horror chamber that we've helped create there. And they're sent to Guantanamo, incidentally. They were sent to Guantanamo, also in violation of the treaty. There was one period of 7 months when Haitian refugees were admitted. Yes. There weren't very many of them during those 7 months. In fact, more Haitians were going back to Haiti than coming out, but some were coming out, and they were admitted. That was the period after the Democratic election. Mm-hmm. When Aristide was elected in 1990, yes. The United States relaxed the blockade and permitted refugees from a democratic country to come. After the expected military coup took place with Bush and Clinton support, they tightened up again and wouldn't let people flee. It's a very revealing story.
It is.
Try to find a word about it anywhere.
Well, it's generally not there, and it's so slow for people to write about the movement from misery to frugality, which is pretty well what happened in Cuba in these decades. And that move is absolutely enormous because misery means you have access to nothing frugality means you really have access to everything in
I
a
mean,
very simple
there's
way.
plenty of things to criticize in Castro's Cuba, but the
Yes.
fact of the matter is that, say, by quality of life indices, they rank surprisingly high.
Oh,
in fact, take, say, health, basic human right.
The LA Times today claimed that Cuba had 100% literacy. That really surprised me.
And health standards that are like the developed countries. This is a poor third world country under constant attack by the global superpower to try to make the population suffer as they state proudly. And it has health standards approximately like those of the U.S.
I don't do much in regard to the ideology, but I first arrived there in the 60s, my first trip after leaving, being expelled from Guatemala. And the thing that touched me was the health of the children. The fact that I couldn't find an unattended child or a child that was not in school. And that is what grabbed me. I was concerned by the fruits of what happened, not so much by the
Especially
ideology.
Anyone who's familiar with the other countries of the region.
Oh, every country has people living on garbage dumps. You can't find a place in Latin America where there isn't a garbage dump community. Yeah. And, of course, I did not find any such community.
And this is in the face of consistent U.S. efforts to make the population suffer.
Yes.
That includes terrorism, and it includes the embargo.
Yes, and that's why everybody should understand why one of the reasons they had tightened up so much. They don't have the civil liberties we have. I mean, we're free to open our porno shop tomorrow morning, but we don't have the human rights. We don't have the right to medical care or the right to education, which they have tried to keep foremost.
My feeling is we should criticize these severe human rights violations.
Yes.
And I've done it, but I've done it in a place where I think it ought to be done, in Havana.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was on Cuban national television, and I very sharply criticized at that moment, the imprisonment of dissidents.
Yeah.
I gave a talk an outdoor talk in Havana, which was moderated by Ricardo Alarcón, incidentally, the UN ambassador.
Yes.
And did the same thing.
Well,
That's where we ought to criticize the human rights violations.
Exactly.
We're here in the United States. We should criticize our human rights violations.
But I had the same experience. While I was there, I wrote an article in Pensamiento Crítico on the fact that they were keeping religious people out of government. And after the second or third assembly of the party, they literally apologized and said this was a silly thing to do, and we welcome people now who have a religious background. And then Fidel did his book with Frei Beto.
Our task here is to end the stranglehold, end the terror, let them be free, let them solve their own affairs.
Exactly. Well, that's gosh, if we could apply that to every country. Now, that's been 50 years. Now we're looking at 60 years since the Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. Would you have any comment on that period? 60 years in Palestine.
Okay, let me just say a word of comparison to Cuba. In the case of Cuba, the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, and since, have been imposing harsh sanctions and terror on the country to try to punish the population because we don't like their leadership. In the case of Palestine, it's even more grotesque. There was a free election in Palestine, just the kind we say we're in favor of.
Yes.
Free election, carefully monitored, deemed fully free and fair. That was January 2006. The United States reacted instantly, within days, by imposing harsh sanctions on the population, supporting Israeli sanctions and increasing terror, with the express goal of making the population suffer so that they would overthrow the government they elected and pick the people we wanted. Furthermore, this is presented openly here, publicly. It's not concealed. It's you read it over and again in the front pages. Yeah, we have to punish the people of Palestine because they voted the wrong way. And in the next column, you see praise for our magnificent dedication to democracy. And apparently this somehow doesn't strike educated people as involving some kind of inconsistency.
We have a real problem with the media, as you've pointed out for decades. The breaking of the wall into Egypt has been called tantamount to the breaking of the Berlin Wall, and we might say the breaking of the wall with Mexico, which is bound to take place. Would you care to comment on that breaking?
Yeah, that was an amazing act of courageous civil disobedience.
Yes.
The U.S. and Israel had the people of Gaza imprisoned.
Yes.
Israel, with U.S. backing, had turned it into a total hellhole, barely livable. It's mainly used for, then come, especially when the election, right after the election that I mentioned, the repression and sanctions and terror increased. I mean, Israel even went to the point of cutting off water flow to Gaza, attacking the power station, which cuts back electricity, but that also means cutting back water, sewage control, allowing hospitals to function, and so on. This, in fact, was upheld by the Israeli High Court recently. They said, yes, it's legitimate to carry out collective punishment. Which is a grave breach of the Geneva Convention.
Absolutely.
But it's legitimate because they fire Qassam rockets. If you look, which they shouldn't, of course, that's criminal and stupid. But if you look at the discussion here, the Qassam rocket, the Israeli actions are invariably called retaliation for Qassam rockets. There's another way of looking at it, namely, Qassam rockets are retaliation for ongoing Israeli, U.S.-backed Israeli crimes in the West Bank.
If there were only some attention to international law, no nation is free to aggressively attack another, but any nation is free to respond to an attack with self-defense. And this is what I think we're seeing here. We've seen 18,000 homes demolished, and we've seen this ongoing collective punishment, which is literally unacceptable.
And speaking of international law, it has by now been definitively agreed, and in fact even the Israeli High Court agrees, that any move of population into the occupied West Bank is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. That was recently ratified again by the World Court, highest judicial authority, with the U.S. Justice agreeing, incidentally, in a separate declaration. That means anything that the U.S. and Israel are doing in the occupied territories is illegal.
Well, we have the problem of law breaking, and then we have something that appears to get into the area of psychosis, and that's the concept that some good is going to be achieved by attacking Iran. I mean, it seems to leave the realm of international law and go into the realm of mental situation. What in the world is behind all that?
Well, every presidential candidate, except maybe Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel, and maybe Ron Paul, has said that we have to keep all options on the table with regard to Iran. That means including the threat of military attack. That's a violation of the UN Charter. Not just the attack, but even the threat. The Charter, which is the basis for modern international law, states that the threat or use of force in international affairs is a crime. But every presidential candidate thinks it's perfectly proper to commit that crime because we're an outlaw state.
Well, when do people become suicidal? I mean, Iran does not have the nukes, but it certainly has major weapons that can reach the green zone, that can reach Tel Aviv. What are they trying to do?
Well,
this is suicidal.
Iran's, it's not. I mean, Iraq was completely defenseless.
Yes.
But Iran is not totally defenseless. It's a big country.
Yes.
But, any aggressor through history, almost every case, has expected that it will suffer too.
Yes.
And in fact, if you take a look at the wars, a great many of them are lost by the country that attacked. But, whatever... I don't think, frankly, that they're going to attack Iran. That would be too insane. But if they do, it would be because it's just a higher priority to ensure that the world is subordinate to your rule than to save your own population. Actually, we have much more dramatic examples than that. Take, say, the invasion of Iraq.
Yes.
The invasion of Iraq was undertaken with the expectation that it would increase the threat of terror. That was pointed out by intelligence agencies, independent analysts, others, and it did, but way more than was anticipated. So the first major study of what they call the Iraq effect, the effect of the Iraq invasion on increasing terror, Peter Bergen and Paul Cruikshank a couple of months ago, using semi-official data, concluded that the Iraq effect was to increase terror sevenfold. That's a pretty big increase. And it's not that the Bush administration wants terror. It's just not a high priority.
Well, it's amazing that they can't understand that if you break into someone's home, brutalize their family.
They understand perfectly well. They don't care.
You're going to develop this resistance, and they're going to call that sometimes Al-Qaeda, which frequently it is not. It's I think the Iraq War now in 17 years, and the people see it only as one war, which began in 1991, is one of the great holocausts of history. We will never totally count the dead.
Let's take the 1990s.
Yes.
Before the invasion.
Before, yes.
The effect of the sanctions. The sanctions probably killed more people than the invasion.
Apparently.
And there are very good studies of this, but they can't be mentioned in the United States.
We certainly don't.
Literally not mentioned. I mean, there were 2 UN administrators for the first couple of years of the sanctions. It was so horrendous that they had to do something. That's the time when Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, made her famous statement about 500,000 dead children.
Yes.
Tough, but the price was right.
Yes.
They couldn't deal with that, so they introduced a humanitarian effort, the Oil for Food program.
Yes.
The humanitarian effort allowed Iraq to use some of its oil revenues to help its own population, deeply humanitarian. There were 2 administrators, both of them distinguished international diplomats with outstanding reputations. The first one, Dennis Halliday, and knowing with tremendous information about Iraq. They had investigators all over the country. They knew more about Iraq than any Westerners. Dennis Halliday, after 2 years, resigned because he said the sanctions were genocidal. He was replaced by Hans von Sponeck, another distinguished international diplomat with a long record. He lasted about 2 years. He resigned, charging that the sanctions violated the Genocide Convention. Von Sponeck also complained that the Security Council was theoretically responsible for this, though it was U.S.-British sanctions. He said the Clinton administration would not let him permit him to report to the Security Council. In fact, the State Department spokesperson, Albright's spokesperson, said that his phrase was, "That man in Baghdad is paid to work, not to talk."
I think, Noam, that the only thing we can do as a nation is to begin to repent. We have to start maybe with the indigenous people and work our way up through a long process of repentance, as the German nation has done. I mean, no one has done a better job of saying they're sorry than Germany.
It's unfortunate but true that those who repent are the defeated.
Yes.
You very rarely find a case of those who committed the crimes owning up to them and conceding.
Well, I hope we can make that change. I'm so anxious, and I know everyone's anxious to read the book, The Essential Chomsky. I don't know how Anthony Arnov could do that, to put it all in one book, because there must be about 80 books right now. So I doubt that he can put it all into one, but we're looking forward to reading The Essential Chomsky, and so grateful to you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Noam.
Yeah.